This is Backroad Ballots, Rural Politics in 2024. I'm Olivia Weeks, a reporter for the Daily Yonder. Here in the final days before the presidential election, I wanted to take some time to check in with our reporters Claire Carlson and Sarah Melotte, as well as our publisher Dee Davis, to hear about any late-breaking news on the rural vote. First, you're going to hear from Dee about the unprecedented nature of this election cycle. And stay tuned for my conversations with Claire and Sarah about the Harris-Walz Tickets rural plan and the effects of Hurricane Helene on voting in western North Carolina. Here's Dee Davis, our publisher. Hi Dee, how are you?
Hey Olivia, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for coming on to this special edition of Backroad Ballots. I just want to talk to you about what's on your mind in the run-up to the presidential election. It's coming up in a couple weeks. What are you thinking about? What do you think is going to be important?
Yes, it's been a zany campaign, right? I mean, it's been so different from others where we're used to more than 2 years of candidates slugging it out in primaries, and everything is compressed, kind of like a European election or an Australian election where it's hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, and boom. And so I think this has made it in some ways, pure election of these different strategies and initiatives, and you have to fail quicker. You have to try things that aren't working quicker and know they're not working quicker. So in some respects, you could chart where a candidate was going, where he or she was making the speeches, and then you would say, okay, that candidate's in trouble there, or that candidate needs to shore up these voters, right? The union voters, the Latino voters. The other thing that's happened is so much money goes into technology now, right? That there used to be strategies for base building and strategies for bridging, getting across the aisle, getting people who are in between or not sure. And and more in recent elections, it's all gone to base. And the technology has all been about how do I find my voters? How can I get that email? How can I get that phone number? And then how can I make sure that they come out to vote on election day or vote before election day? Um, and it's intensified in such a way that now a huge part. I mean, always before, campaigns spent so much money on television, right? But now television is such a dissipated market that you can't really get to people. You can get to people on NFL games, right? That's the one thing everybody watches, and you see a lot of advertising on sporting events. What they're doing is really using the technology to find everyone's proclivities, what they're interested in, what they hate. Are they hunters? Do they knit? And then once you find out whether the voter's a hunter or a knitter, then you just plan on giving them messages that fit your conceptions of hunters and knitters. But now, in these last few weeks, people are just getting beat to death, right? They're just getting so much information. And of course, it's amped up in a way that it's not just it's a bad election or the nation will perish. It's the world will perish if I vote the wrong way.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that idea that the world's going to end if you vote the wrong way. When the Harris-Walz campaign really got going this summer, I think one of the big moments was when Tim Walz said, Trump and JD Vance are weirdos. He sort of
Mm-hmm.
eschewed the fascist language and went towards trying to strike a lighter tone that's still very critical of Trump and his former administration and his campaign, but that doesn't do all of that doom and gloom messaging that the Biden campaign was very prone to. Has that strategy continued, or have they gone back to the democracy is gonna die kind of narratives? How do you see the temperature of the rhetoric right now?
I think that strategy ran its course. That I think it was an attention grabber at first, but it's really hard to go toe to toe with Trump calling names. I mean, he says Harris isn't mentally fit. I mean, he's used terms like retarded. I mean, stuff that is just beyond any sense of what's appropriate. And in Minnesota, to be weird is, you know, that's actually fairly bold in a place where people are so nice. Now you see that it has moved to questions of stability. General Milley says he is unfit. So it goes from name calling to a kind of a panache of policy, right? So the Democrat strategy has really been to move away from the name calling because I don't think they were had the stomach for it, or they probably just weren't that good at it.
How do you think the media is done with this compressed election cycle? As you've mentioned, you've been a longtime commentator on the way that rural politics are covered, that kind of thing. So, what do you think's going on this year?
I mean, in some ways, the issue is who's looking at your paper, who's looking at your TV program, who's listening to your podcast in a place where there's so many voices competing. So the New York Times reader has made up his or her mind a long time ago, right? There is nobody who's undecided. People say they're undecided. It just means we always heard what I learned in political marketing class was that just means they're not going to vote. And so those people who won't declare but maybe will still show up, I can understand why the campaigns go after them. But what is the medium? So you can see um, Trump is going on a lot of programs that focus on single young white men. And she's gone on a range of programs, podcasts, like she went on Call Her Daddy, which is you know, it really has an audience of a lot of younger women. She just went on a Charlemagne the Great, which was to really focus on young African American men. So this is you can look at the media presence and kind of see where people feel like they're either in trouble or they need to rally. The media always kind of gets it right and screws up. My my dad used to say we always had floods when I was growing up in East Kentucky, and my dad would say that the National Weather Bureau always gets it right. First, you would get a prediction it's going to crest at 32 feet. Then you get a prediction it's going to crest at 29 feet. Then you get a prediction it's going to be 27 feet. And then when it crested, they would say so that, the flood is going to crest at 25 feet. And in a way, that's what the media does. I mean, they'll be all over the board. This, if she loses, this will be because she spent this money on this, and if he loses, it's going to be because he was so mean to this. I mean, in the end, those of us who pay a lot of attention get more information than we can use, and some of it will be right.
Mhm. I have just one reflection on the media in this election cycle that I wanna hear what you think about, which is that I think just based on the media that I consume, I swallowed the narrative, I think, from the liberal establishment media that JD Vance was kind of a schlub of a VP pick and that it was a bad idea and that he was a weirdo and voters weren't gonna like him, and then I watched the VP debate and I was really surprised at how poised he was and how much better of a speaker for the Trump administration or for the Trump agenda he was than Trump himself. And I don't know. I wonder what you think about that or whether you had a different reaction.
No, I just think you only get a couple of times to introduce yourself. And I think in the convention, he did not come off well. And then I think both sides decided to make the vice presidential debate uh, like a polite debating society where they were comporting themselves with great care and decorum, and all of a sudden that becomes a platform for presenting yourself in a different way and reintroducing yourself. And so a lot of us would say, is that true, is that false? But it's the macro picture we mostly take away. Is that person reasonable? Would you speak to him if he was your next door neighbor? Uh, would you lend him a cup of sugar? I think in some ways that it's not just about policy and it's not just about positions. It's about what kind of neighbor would it be?
Thanks so much for talking with me, Dee. Appreciate it. Up next is Daily Yonder reporter Claire Carlson. Hi, Claire. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for coming on this special edition of Backroad Ballots. I just want to talk to you about your reporting in the lead up to the election. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about what's on your plate right now and what kind of questions you're asking about rural politics in the last just couple of weeks now.
Yeah, definitely. The focus, of course, has been on presidential election. It's been really interesting looking at how the Harris Bowles campaign has really shifted focus onto rural voters. Tim Walz did a campaign event in Lawrence County, Pennsylvania, that was hosted by rural voters for Harris. And it was very clear that they're trying to court the rural vote. So the question I've been asking is it working? And that's a hard question to answer because we won't know until next month.
Yeah, we certainly will not. So I'm curious about the substance of that campaign event. I know you wrote about Waltz's rural plan. Can you tell me a little bit about the actual bullet points on that agenda?
Yeah. So the agenda, there's a few bullet points. They're trying to expand healthcare access in rural communities. One of the interesting parts of that is they're really trying to support independent pharmacies. And one of their specific goals is to actually open 3,000 new pharmacies in rural areas, which I thought was just an interestingly specific proposal, especially that this is still the campaign. So it's kind of unusual to see such a specific plan laid out. But they're also focusing on agriculture. At the event in Pennsylvania, there was a lot of talk about how corporate consolidation of agriculture has put a lot of small farmers and ranchers out of business. And that's really been a huge blow to a lot of small towns across the country. Tim Walz, he has a farming background. He grew up in Nebraska. He was able to speak really fluently about that, which I think is one of the reasons Kamala Harris chose him as her VP, because he's really able to speak to those issues. And some of the other stuff, he talked a lot about broadband. They want to bring back the Affordable Connectivity Program, which gives folks of a certain income level discounted internet access. And that's hugely beneficial for people in rural areas where there's not great broadband infrastructure still.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful. I wonder, I mean, I realize that these plans might be sort of scant on details, but as far as the way that I see it is that a lot of these problems that Waltz's plan is trying to address are based on really fundamental problems with the role of rural America in the American economy. And so I wonder if you see a sort of credible pathway to, for instance, getting 10,000 more healthcare workers in rural America. That was one detail that really struck me. or corporate farming, obviously really, really deep problem. How are they handling that disconnect between the things we'd like to see done and how deep-rooted those problems really are?
I think they're aware of kind of the deeply structural problems that go back for decades, that have really created the specifically rural issues we talk about at the Daily Yonder all the time. I think Tim Walz, he does have, between the two of them, the most understanding of that because he has the experience of it, more than Kamala Harris does. I'll be curious how they're going to lay out any specific policy that will actually address some of those structural problems, because I think it's going to be really difficult. Like even if they do become the president and the president of the United States, they're going to have, I think, a challenging time getting some of these goals done. Especially, I mean, when you're looking at agriculture, that lobby is so strong that I think it is really hard to get anything done. I mean, the farm bill is a really good example of that. It's been 2 years now that the farm bill has not, it expired in 2023. They've not been able to get a new farm bill passed, and that's because of a lot of Republican pushback. And I think they're going to continue to see that. So, yeah, I'll be curious if they're actually able to deliver on a lot of these promises. But I do think they're talking about it in a way that indicates to me that they do understand some of the problems that rural America has been facing for a long time.
Mhm. Yeah, one more thing I wanted to ask you specifically about that Pennsylvania campaign rally that you wrote about was about his commentary on gun control. So he said both that nobody from the Harris-Walz administration is trying to take your guns away, and also we're gonna make sure that nobody's gonna shoot your kids at school. I mean, that's a rough paraphrase, but that's sort of the gist of his comments on gun control. And I just wondered whether it's your sense that people, rural Americans in particular, maybe do they take comments like that seriously, or does it sound like wishful thinking?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot too because it feels, this is my opinion on it, it's kind of felt like pandering to a rural America that they obviously gun culture is very strong in rural America. I think Tim Walz, I mean, he was talking a lot about hunting as well at this Pennsylvania campaign event. And he didn't specify how they're going to both support Second Amendment gun rights while also preventing these mass shootings that we're seeing. I think he was referencing a lot of them, like wanting to increase background checks for gun owners, but it's still, I don't think any of the policies that they've talked about would substantively decrease a lot of the gun violence we're seeing. And I think it's clear that they do not want to take a really strong take on guns because they're courting the rural vote. From my own conversations with my very rural Pennsylvania family, all of whom are gun owners, I don't think those comments mean a lot to them, because there's still a lot of this perception that has, I think, been built by kind of this far right camp that we're seeing, that Democrats do want to take away people's guns. And I mean, that's why Tim Walz and Kamala Harris have been very careful with how they talk about guns. But I think that message that the left is going to take away your guns has permeated at least the parts of rural Pennsylvania that my family's from. It's hard to speak for all rural Americans, but it's clear that the Harris-Walz campaign is being very careful with the way they talk about guns because they're trying to court this rural vote.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your reporting on election denialism and the repercussions that's had in small counties across the country, and the way that it affects election workers in rural counties. And I think you've also done some reporting on some, like, technically metropolitan, but like small city counties. Can you just talk a little bit about what's led you to do that reporting and what you've been finding, what you've been hearing?
I first got interested in writing about election denialism mainly because of a kind of fascination I have in the way conspiratorial thinking becomes mainstream. And over the past 4 years, the conspiracy that there's this election fraud that's happening that actually put Joe Biden in office in 2020. It's been really interesting to me how that has not died out. Obviously, the January 6th insurrection was a very showy event of this claim that the election was stolen. But I think I've been interested about what that means at the more local scale. So, a lot of county clerks, those are the people I've been interviewing a lot about election denialism. It's been interesting to see how it takes place on the ground. And it's happening, these claims are happening. It's not inherently a rural thing to believe that the election was stolen. But these county clerks, the problem that they're experiencing that is new is that they used to be treated. This is kind of what the folks I've interviewed have told me. People kind of used to understand that they were part of their community. Like the county clerk, sure, they're an elections official, but they're also your neighbor. I was thinking about this earlier. People don't split their ballots anymore. So, people used to vote Republican in the presidential election, but they would vote for a Democratic senator, for example. People aren't splitting their ticket as much anymore, which I think is a really good indication of how siloed these things have become. And you see it come out at the very local level where county clerks actually are getting more threats from this movement of people who think that the election was stolen. And I think it's been really very bad for those communities because people are they're not viewing county clerks as their neighbor anymore. They're viewing them as this sort of like evil force from the outside, even though county clerks for the most part have worked in those counties for decades. That's been really interesting to me, especially when you think about it through this increasingly politically polarized viewpoint, which I think about all the time because you hear about it a lot and experience it.
I wanted to ask one thing about this reporting project, which is just that it seems to me like election denialism should be a smaller problem in rural counties just because the vast majority of rural counties indeed voted for Donald Trump, and that's the constituency that is the most concerned about potential ballot fraud. How did you come to see this as a necessary investigation?
Yeah. I think it's because rural places have the most to lose from these rumors because a lot of elections offices in rural counties are underfunded and understaffed. In Oregon, where I live, there have been several county clerks that have gotten in rural counties that have gotten so many threats that they've actually left their offices. That's a huge problem in a rural community. It is harder to fill that position once someone leaves. The same thing happened in California in Shasta County. Kathy Darling Allen, someone I interviewed a few times, she's now left. I think it's just that, yeah, again, I want to emphasize that it's not inherently rural to believe this, but those offices have the most to lose when they are targeted with conspiracies like this.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for checking in about your election reporting, Claire. I think this was really useful.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Here's the Daily Yonder's data reporter, Sarah Melotte. Hi, Sarah. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I wanted to talk to you today about some reporting you did a few months ago about this idea that rural people are overrepresented in national politics. So, this idea that their votes matter more than the votes of people who live in the suburbs or in cities. Can you just start with your top line finding there? And then I'd like to hear a little bit about how you got started on that project.
The top line main finding is that after a lot of data digging, I found that rural voters are not overrepresented in the federal government in electoral politics. In other words, they don't wield more than their fair share of power in deciding national elections. So that's kind of the main finding. And I feel like I need to do some background explaining to make that make sense. But essentially, people who are worried about unequal representation in the federal government will often cite the small state bias to kind of support this idea that rural voters have an unfair advantage in the Electoral College and the Senate. And the small state bias refers to the outsized influence that states with small populations have in the Senate and Electoral College. I guess I can give a real world example in the Senate. We'll start there. So the Senate has 2 senators from every state, as we know, and that is regardless of population size. So it really doesn't matter that California's population exceeds Rhode Island's by almost 38 million residents. Both states get 2 Senate seats. This is a real concern. The small state bias is real, but it's not necessarily because of rural voters.
Yeah. So just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, can you just get into a little bit more detail about why that's inaccurate or what that conceals, that kind of statement?
Right. It's inaccurate because it confuses small population with rurality, and they are not the same things. So the majority of the rural population in the US lives in a state where actually the majority of the population in that state is urban.
Mhm.
And so it becomes really confusing when you start equating small states with rural. They're not the same. No technical definition of rural exists at the state level. Um, and so, just to give you an example, predominantly urban states like Delaware and Rhode Island, these are also very small population states. But only 9% of the population in Rhode Island is rural, according to the census definition of rural, which there's lots of different definitions, but we're using the census definition in this conversation. So, if that gives you kind of an idea of how they're not synonymous terms,
Mhm.
and even well-meaning journalists and scholars will refer to them as kind of the same thing, and they kind of get thrown in there together as synonyms, and they're just not.
This reporting that you did was really intuitive to me because I'm from rural Southern Illinois, which is a state that's politics are literally entirely dominated by a few counties in the northeastern corner around Chicago. And so it was always very confusing to me when people would say, like, oh, rural voters are so powerful, they hold this outsized influence, because I would think about my own state where if you look at a map, it's entirely red except for this one little pocket of urban voters up near Chicago. And I was thinking, yeah, but I mean, everybody I know, their rural votes got discounted in every election except for the hyper local one. So the way we talk about it really conceals a lot. And I think it's really interesting. So I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about what the stakes of this project are for you. Like, why did you think that this was a political narrative that really needed to be corrected?
It's important because it vilifies rural voters. Rural voters, if you've been following the Daily Yonder for any length of time, you've read anything that we've written about rural politics, you know that they're not a monolith. They're not all the same. Um, and I think it kind of blocks them all into this group of people who are just like wielding around all of this power and subjecting everybody else to it. And, the data doesn't support that. And, I've looked at this data from a couple of different angles. I've even done this analysis with a few different definitions of rural. And according to the definitions of rural that geographers take seriously, like the Office of Management and Budget and the census definition of rural, none of these figures come out to make it look like rural has an unfair advantage in electoral politics and deciding elections. Even though it might be true that there are inequalities in the electoral college, or there are blocks of voters, like voters of color, who don't get as fair representation in the House of Representatives, for example. But all of these inequalities are not the fault of rural voters. And depending on how you look at it, there's actually some evidence to suggest that rural people are actually underrepresented. Because if you look at the House of Representatives, for example, only 10% of congressional districts are majority rural, which in that case I'm referring to districts where over 50% of the population is a rural resident, according to the census definition. But 20% of the American population, according to the census, is rural. And so, if they're not enjoying their equal representation in Congress using this logic, at least, you could make the case that they're underrepresented. It's more than just a personal pet peeve that it's something that I get up in arms about, someone who's like kind of a geography nerd. It's also kind of like vilifying rural people unnecessarily. And I think it's timely right now because we're about to, not just at the Daily Yonder, but as a nation, we're about to talk a lot about electoral politics and the Electoral College because we're about to have an election. And so I just feel like we can leave rural voters out of the Electoral College conversations. That would be great.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I want to shift gears a little bit and talk to you about what's going on in your home community right now. So you live in Western North Carolina, which is obviously just absolutely battered by Hurricane Helene. I first of all just want to know what recovery looks like there and what feelings and the vibes are on the ground as people try to piece their lives back together. And then, yeah, I'm also curious about whether you have a sense of any political implications from either the hurricane itself or the way that recovery efforts have been handled so far just in the last couple of weeks since this happened.
Yeah, I live in Mitchell County, which is about an hour north of Asheville, if you're familiar with the area. And so I've been out on a reporting trip and then visiting family since it happened. So I've not actually been back home since the hurricane, but I've been in touch with friends who have, and it's devastating. And there's a lot of work to be done. Thankfully, everyone that I know is safe and my home is okay. Yeah, there's a lot of concern about what kind of impact this is going to have on the election. Are people going to be able to get to the polls because of trees that are still needing to be picked out of the roads? Or are they going to be able to get the information they need about what they need to be able to vote because they don't have internet? Because a lot of people still don't have power, a lot of people still don't have water. I have a bad feeling about how this is going to impact voter turnout because when you see areas that lack infrastructure or don't have adequate access to broadband internet or are heavily impoverished or economically distressed, there's an impact on voter turnout. Those things decrease the share of the population that goes to the polls. And so it's going to impact the number of people who are going to be able to get out and vote. And although it doesn't maybe sound that important for maybe just one election, it's, I don't know, voting is a really important part of participating in democracy, and I just worry about what kind of impact that's going to have on the community and how people feel connected to each other and whether they feel like their voices are heard at the polls, because, that can cause a lot of unrest and turmoil, and I'm just worried that it's going to create more anxiety. But I have seen so much positivity from most people in terms of people wanting to get out and help other people, help their communities and volunteer. So we'll see.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I'll be thinking about you and your community in the next few weeks. I really hope that those recovery efforts succeed in some way. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah, thank you.
Backroad Ballots, Rural Politics in 2024 is a production of Rural Remix. Original music was composed by Quincy Pombert and Leo Pozell. This episode was produced by Olivia Weeks and produced and edited by Susanna Brown. Assistant producers are Anya Slepian and Julia Tilton. Our executive producer is Joel Cohen. Thanks to the staff of the Daily Yonder and the Rural Assembly. You've been listening to Rural Remix. Check out our feed for more podcasts highlighting deeper, richer stories about life in rural places.